It was a golden afternoon by the ocean. The breeze smelled of salt and roses, and the sky over the beach house shimmered as if it were blessing my son's wedding. I had spent weeks making sure every candle was perfect. Every plate gleamed. Every ribbon on the chairs was tied just right. Watching my boy stand there in his tuxedo, holding hands with the woman he said was his forever, I thought my heart would finally rest. For years, I had carried everything alone: widowhood, bills, memories of a man I loved more than my own life. That day, surrounded by laughter and cameras, I believed my sacrifices had built something lasting. The ceremony was elegant, like a dream built on fragile glass. Her dress sparkled like snow, her smile painted for the world. When she hugged me, her perfume was strong, expensive, and cold. I told myself she was just nervous, that her stiffness was from the crowd, not from me. My son looked so proud, introducing her as if she were his salvation. I smiled for the pictures. I raised my glass when they toasted. I even laughed at her jokes that barely hid the edge underneath. Maybe I was tired, or maybe I just didn't want to see what was already there. The beginning of distance, the quiet rearranging of power. The reception blurred with music and congratulations. I drifted between tables, listening to laughter that didn't include me. When the cake was cut and everyone began to dance, I stepped outside for air. The evening breeze was gentle, brushing against the years written on my skin. I leaned against the wooden post of the porch and closed my eyes. The ocean murmured softly, like it had always done when my husband was alive. I thought of him, how he'd promised this house would always belong to family, how he believed love could anchor anything. And then I heard it. Behind me, through the half-open door, came a voice I almost didn't recognize at first. Sharp, amused, too young to understand the weight of her words. It was my new daughter-in-law. She was laughing, her voice dripping with champagne and arrogance. She said something about putting his mom in a nursing home. Then she added, "We'll take that beach house. It'll make the perfect weekend spot." For a moment, I couldn't move. The world went silent. The waves vanished. Even the music inside stopped in my head. My chest tightened so hard it hurt to breathe. I stood frozen, my hand gripping the porch railing, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe she didn't mean it. But the laughter that followed, carefree, victorious, told me exactly what kind of woman had just married my son. I didn't go back inside. I couldn't. I walked to the edge of the sand and looked at the water shimmering under the fading light. My reflection trembled in the tide, like it didn't know who I was anymore. I thought about all the nights I'd stayed up, working double shifts to keep this house, how my husband and I built it with our bare hands. Every nail, every wall held our story. And now that story was being rewritten by someone who hadn't earned a single brick. Inside, they danced under fairy lights, toasting to forever. I stayed outside until the laughter faded. My son never noticed I was gone. When the last guests left and the night went quiet, I packed the last of the dishes and folded my shawl. My tears came quietly without warning. They tasted like salt and wisdom. Somewhere between the sobs, a strange calm settled over me. By morning, I wasn't broken anymore. I brewed coffee, sat at the same table where my husband used to read the paper, and stared at the sun rising over the water. I thought about what she said, put his mom in a nursing home, and I smiled. Not the kind of smile people show in photos, but the kind that knows exactly what must be done. That day, before the wedding decorations were even taken down, I called my lawyer. I had owned this beach house long before my son was born, and there was another house, one she believed belonged to her husband. She'd soon learn that not everything that glitters belongs to her. The tide outside rose higher as I signed the papers. The pen didn't shake. For the first time in years, my hands were steady. The lawyer looked at me as if he wanted to ask why I was smiling, but I didn't explain. Some storms don't need thunder. They just need quiet resolve. The morning sunlight slipped through the kitchen blinds, pale and quiet. My coffee had already gone cold, but I kept holding the cup anyway. On the table sat the wedding photo someone had sent overnight. My son and his new wife smiling under strings of golden lights. They looked perfect, untouched by the weight that lived inside my chest. I traced my finger across his face and whispered a small blessing he'd never hear. Then I folded the photo, slid it into an envelope, and wrote a short note inside. Congratulations again. I hope your honeymoon is everything you dreamed of. Love, Mom. When I sealed that letter, my hands didn't tremble. They used to, back when I thought forgiveness was weakness. But that day, something inside me had shifted. I was done being the woman who waited for people to realize her worth. I was ready to protect what little dignity I had left. The lawyer had already called by 9. He confirmed the sale had gone through. Both properties, the beach house and the suburban home my son thought was in his name, were no longer tied to me, or to them. The funds were safely transferred to a trust I'd created for my retirement and for the scholarship foundation my late husband always talked about. It wasn't about revenge, not entirely. It was about reclaiming control, one final time. I watched the waves through the window, the way they crashed and rebuilt themselves over and over. They didn't apologize for changing. Neither would I. By noon, I walked through each empty room for the last time. The beach house smelled of salt, dust, and faint echoes of laughter that didn't belong here anymore. The walls still remembered every summer barbecue, every birthday candle blown out by small hands, every silent prayer I whispered when my husband got sick. My footsteps echoed softly, like the past saying goodbye. I stopped in front of the mirror near the entryway. The woman staring back wasn't the same one who had stood outside that wedding hall. Her back was straighter. Her eyes, though tired, were steady. Grief had shaped her spine into something unbreakable. The real estate agent arrived to hand me the final documents. She smiled politely, unaware that this house had just witnessed its last secret. When I handed her the keys, she said, "It's a beautiful place, ma'am. Someone will be lucky to have it." I nodded. It was never about luck, I said softly. That afternoon, I drove to the small apartment I'd already rented by the harbor. It wasn't grand, just one bedroom, a modest kitchen, and a view of the sea through old wooden blinds. But it was mine. No ghosts, no expectations. Just peace. I unpacked slowly. My husband's watch, my favorite mug, one photo of the 3 of us back when life still felt kind. Everything else could stay behind. Later that evening, as the sky turned the color of bruised peach, my phone buzzed. It was my son. His voice carried excitement, oblivious to the shift that had already happened. He said they were flying back from their honeymoon early, something about wanting to check on the house. I told him I hoped their trip had been wonderful. I didn't tell him what awaited them. When I hung up, I sat by the window and watched the tide come in. The water always took what it wanted. Slow, patient, unstoppable. I realized I'd become a little like that tide. Quiet, persistent, cleansing everything in my path. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The sky outside was pale and silent. I brewed fresh coffee and wrote a second note, short and polite, just like the first. The house by the beach has been sold. The other one, too. I needed to start over. I hope you do the same. I left it on the kitchen counter of the suburban house before locking the door for the final time. By the time they returned, I was already miles away. The lawyer later told me the daughter-in-law's reaction was explosive, shouting, crying, accusing. My son tried calling me 17 times that day. I didn't answer any of them. Some lessons, I thought, are learned only when the echo finally fades. Days passed quietly. I took morning walks by the shore, fed the stray cat that visited my window, learned to cook for one again. Sometimes, when the wind carried the sound of laughter from families passing by, it stung, but less each day. I didn't hate my son. I just no longer recognized him. One afternoon, I visited the local library to sign the paperwork for the scholarship trust in my husband's name. The woman at the desk asked who the first recipient should be. I said, "Someone who works hard and doesn't wait for others to rescue them." When I walked home that evening, I passed a group of newlyweds taking pictures near the pier. Their joy was loud and pure, untouched by betrayal. I smiled at them, not with bitterness, but with a quiet of understanding. People think revenge is fire, quick and burning. But it isn't. It's water. It reshapes the land slowly, leaving it cleaner. That night, as I sat by my window, I watched the lights flicker across the harbor. My phone vibrated once, a new message from my son. "I'm sorry, Mom." I didn't reply. I just whispered into the night, "I hope you finally see what love costs when you take it for granted." The waves rolled in again, steady as breath. I closed my eyes and let the sound carry me. The world, for once, felt quiet enough for peace. The sound of the harbor had become my clock. Every morning, the waves came in slow and deliberate, brushing against the rocks like they were whispering secrets only the sea could keep. It had been a week since I signed the papers and left everything behind. The beach house was no longer mine, and yet I didn't feel loss. I felt release. My son hadn't stopped calling, but I had stopped listening. There's a kind of silence that doesn't need to be explained. It's the sound of peace when the heart finally chooses itself. On the 7th morning, I walked to the small diner across from the pier. The waitress, a woman about my age, poured me coffee without asking. She said I looked lighter, as if a heavy cloud had finally moved. I smiled and said nothing. People think revenge burns you from the inside, but sometimes it clears the air so you can breathe again. As I sat there stirring my coffee, I watched the mail truck stop by the corner. The driver handed me a small envelope with my name written in my son's handwriting. I didn't open it right away. I slipped it into my purse, paid the bill, and walked home with the wind pressing softly against my back. At my table, I tore the edge carefully. Inside was a short note, just a few lines. He said they came back to find the house empty, the locks changed, the rooms stripped clean. He said his wife cried, accused him of being careless, of letting an old woman outsmart them. He didn't apologize directly. Instead, he wrote, "I didn't know what she said to you, but I wish I had listened." I placed the letter beside my coffee cup and let it sit there until the ink smudged under a small ring of condensation. That night, I dreamt of my husband. He was sitting on the porch of the beach house, wearing the same blue sweater he always wore in early spring. He didn't say anything, just looked at me and nodded, like he already knew what I had done. When I woke up, the room was still and filled with light. I took it as his way of telling me I had done enough. 2 days later, the phone rang again. This time I answered. His voice was softer than I remembered, slower, stripped of that confidence I once envied. He said they were moving to another state, starting over. He said he understood if I didn't want to see them. I told him I wanted him to be happy. Then I said I needed to go. There was nothing left to explain. After that call, I decided to walk down to the pier again. The fishermen were hauling in nets heavy with silver flashes. A small boy waved at me, holding a seashell he said looked like a heart. I took it, thanked him, and slipped it into my pocket. It felt warm, alive, like something the sea had decided to return. Every day after that followed a rhythm. Morning coffee, short walks, quiet evenings by the window. I wrote letters I never sent. One to my son, one to my husband, one to myself. They weren't about pain, they were about release. I told myself forgiveness wasn't for him, it was for me. When you've carried a family on your back for decades, setting it down doesn't make you cruel. It makes you human. One evening, the sunset turned the sky gold and violet. I sat outside with a cup of tea and watched the colors fade. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to hold on to anyone's memory. The apartment smelled like lemon soap and sea breeze. My plants had started to bloom again. Life, in its quiet way, had begun to rebuild itself around me. A few weeks later, the lawyer called again. He said the sale had gone through completely, and the trust fund was active. He congratulated me, but I just thanked him and asked him to make one more transfer to the local community center. It was small, but it would pay for their children's art classes. I wanted something good to come out of all that loss. That night, I walked down to the harbor one last time before the season turned. The tide was low, revealing a strip of wet sand glinting under the moonlight. I took off my shoes and stepped into the cool water. The waves reached my ankles and pulled back gently, as if they were testing my resolve. I looked out to where the horizon blurred into the dark and whispered my husband's name. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. The sea already knew what it meant to let go. Back at home, I sat by the window again, looking at the small seashell the boy had given me. I set it next to the folded note from my son. The contrast between the two made me realize something. I had raised him to build his own life, not to guard mine. He had chosen his path. And now, so had I. The last light flickered out across the water, and I felt the kind of stillness that doesn't come from revenge or victory, but from understanding that you've survived something meant to break you. I turned off the lamp and sat in the quiet, the hum of the world soft and distant. Outside, the wind carried the smell of salt and dusk. The sea kept its rhythm, endless and forgiving. Somewhere out there, my son was learning what it meant to build a home on his own. And I, finally free, was learning how to live in mine. The sound of the harbor had become my clock. Every morning, the waves came in slow and deliberate, brushing against the rocks like they were whispering secrets only the sea could keep. It had been a week since I signed the papers and left everything behind. The beach house was no longer mine, and yet I didn't feel loss. I felt release. My son hadn't stopped calling, but I had stopped listening. There's a kind of silence that doesn't need to be explained. It's the sound of peace when the heart finally chooses itself. On the 7th morning, I walked to the small diner across from the pier. The waitress, a woman about my age, poured me coffee without asking. She said I looked lighter, as if a heavy cloud had finally moved. I smiled and said nothing. People think revenge burns you from the inside, but sometimes it clears the air so you can breathe again. As I sat there stirring my coffee, I watched the mail truck stop by the corner. The driver handed me a small envelope with my name written in my son's handwriting. I didn't open it right away. I slipped it into my purse, paid the bill, and walked home with the wind pressing softly against my back. At my table, I tore the edge carefully. Inside was a short note, just a few lines. He said they came back to find the house empty, the locks changed, the rooms stripped clean. He said his wife cried, accused him of being careless, of letting an old woman outsmart them. He didn't apologize directly. Instead, he wrote, "I didn't know what she said to you, but I wish I had listened." I placed the letter beside my coffee cup and let it sit there until the ink smudged under a small ring of condensation. That night, I dreamt of my husband. He was sitting on the porch of the beach house, wearing the same blue sweater he always wore in early spring. He didn't say anything, just looked at me and nodded, like he already knew what I had done. When I woke up, the room was still and filled with light. I took it as his way of telling me I had done enough. 2 days later, the phone rang again. This time I answered. His voice was softer than I remembered, slower, stripped of that confidence I once envied. He said they were moving to another state, starting over. He said he understood if I didn't want to see them. I told him I wanted him to be happy. Then I said I needed to go. There was nothing left to explain. After that call, I decided to walk down to the pier again. The fishermen were hauling in nets heavy with silver flashes. A small boy waved at me, holding a seashell he said looked like a heart. I took it, thanked him, and slipped it into my pocket. It felt warm, alive, like something the sea had decided to return. Every day after that followed a rhythm. Morning coffee, short walks, quiet evenings by the window. I wrote letters I never sent. One to my son, one to my husband, one to myself. They weren't about pain, they were about release. I told myself forgiveness wasn't for him, it was for me. When you've carried a family on your back for decades, setting it down doesn't make you cruel. It makes you human. One evening, the sunset turned the sky gold and violet. I sat outside with a cup of tea and watched the colors fade. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to hold on to anyone's memory. The apartment smelled like lemon soap and sea breeze. My plants had started to bloom again. Life, in its quiet way, had begun to rebuild itself around me. A few weeks later, the lawyer called again. He said the sale had gone through completely, and the trust fund was active. He congratulated me, but I just thanked him and asked him to make one more transfer to the local community center. It was small, but it would pay for their children's art classes. I wanted something good to come out of all that loss. That night, I walked down to the harbor one last time before the season turned. The tide was low, revealing a strip of wet sand glinting under the moonlight. I took off my shoes and stepped into the cool water. The waves reached my ankles and pulled back gently, as if they were testing my resolve. I looked out to where the horizon blurred into the dark and whispered my husband's name. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. The sea already knew what it meant to let go. Back at home, I sat by the window again, looking at the small seashell the boy had given me. I set it next to the folded note from my son. The contrast between the two made me realize something. I had raised him to build his own life, not to guard mine. He had chosen his path. And now, So had I. The last light flickered out across the water, and I felt the kind of stillness that doesn't come from revenge or victory, but from understanding that you've survived something meant to break you. I turned off the lamp and sat in the quiet, the hum of the world soft and distant. Outside, the wind carried the smell of salt and dusk. The sea kept its rhythm, endless and forgiving. Somewhere out there, my son was learning what it meant to build a home on his own. And I, finally free, was learning how to live in mine. The days slipped by in quiet rhythm. The ocean outside my window had learned my schedule. Morning coffee, afternoon walk, evening stillness. Every sound had its place now. The cry of gulls, the soft clatter of dishes, the wind sighing against the window pane. My life had shrunk into something small, but it finally fit me. The noise of disappointment had gone silent. I kept the letter from my son folded inside a drawer, beneath my bills and the spare keys. Sometimes I thought about replying. Sometimes I didn't. There were no words that could explain to him that what I did wasn't about revenge. It was about memory, about protecting the last piece of love that hadn't yet been tainted by greed. He would never understand that the moment I heard her voice at that wedding, the part of me that believed in family had already died. One afternoon, a knock came at my door. It startled me. I hadn't had visitors since I moved here. When I opened it, a young man stood holding a clipboard. He said he was from the real estate office, checking on the new tenants who had moved into the house next to mine. For a split second, I thought he was here for me, that something had gone wrong with the sale, that I'd have to go back and face them again. But he smiled politely and walked away, leaving behind only the faint smell of cologne and the memory of my old fear. That night, I sat by the window with the lights off, watching the harbor lamps shimmer on the water. Somewhere across that black horizon, my son and his wife were starting over. I didn't wish them harm. I just wish they understood that peace isn't free. You earn it by learning what not to destroy. The next morning, I received another envelope, smaller than the first. It wasn't from my son this time. It was from my lawyer. Inside was confirmation that the charity fund had begun its first outreach project. A group of children from the community center would be taken to the beach every Saturday for art lessons. I smiled as I read it, thinking of the laughter that would echo across the same shore where I'd once overheard betrayal. Life, it seemed, had a strange sense of poetry. For weeks, I watched them from my window, those children painting seashells and drawing seagulls with bright chalk. Their joy filled the air that once held bitterness. And each time I saw their teacher hand them brushes, I felt something in my chest ease, as if forgiveness were a tide rising slowly, washing the last traces of anger away. Still, there were nights when the silence pressed heavy against the walls. Sometimes I would hear the echo of my daughter-in-law's voice in my head, her laughter, her cruelty, the way she said nursing home like it was a punchline. I would close my eyes and let the memory pass through me, refusing to let it stay. There's power in remembering, but there's freedom in letting it fade. One Sunday, after church, I decided to stop by the diner again. The waitress recognized me and poured me the same dark coffee. She said she had seen a young couple asking about me a few days earlier. They said they were my family. I thanked her for telling me and left a generous tip. That evening, I packed a small bag, just in case. I didn't want confrontation. I had nothing left to give them. But if they found me, I wanted to face it without fear. I wasn't the same woman who once cried in her car outside a wedding hall. I was no longer afraid of being alone. A few days later, they did come. I saw their car pull up near the harbor, a rented sedan, dusty from travel. My son stepped out first. He looked older, tired, maybe humbled. The woman beside him wore sunglasses even though it was cloudy. She didn't look at me when they approached, only at the ground. My son asked if we could talk. We sat on the bench overlooking the water. He told me they had been struggling, that things hadn't worked out as planned. The house she thought was his was gone, the beach house too. They had been staying in motels, chasing jobs, arguing. He said he realized too late that love built on taking never lasts. He asked if I could forgive him. I listened quietly. The seagulls cried above us, and the waves hissed softly at the shore. Forgiveness had already taken root in me weeks ago, but I didn't say the words. Instead, I placed my hand over his, the same hand I used to hold when he was a child crossing the street. That was enough. He looked down and nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. The woman stood behind him, arms crossed, her pride unraveling thread by thread. She muttered something under her breath, something sharp, but I didn't catch it. I didn't need to. She was already smaller than her own bitterness. Before they left, my son turned and asked if he could visit again sometime. I told him the door was open, but only if he came alone. He nodded. For the first time in years, his shoulders looked lighter as he walked away. After they drove off, I sat on that bench for a long time. The tide was rising, bringing the scent of salt and rain. I felt my husband's presence beside me again, not as a ghost, but as memory, warm and steady. He used to say that storms don't last forever. They only remind us where to build stronger walls. That evening I returned home, placed my son's letter and the seashell side by side on the windowsill, and lit a small candle. Its flame flickered gently, casting golden shapes across the wall. I whispered a prayer, not for revenge, not for regret, but for renewal. The sea outside answered with a soft crash like applause from the earth itself. I closed my eyes and let the rhythm carry me. Somewhere I knew my son would find his own quiet. As for me, I already had mine. The following week carried a different kind of quiet. The days were still slow, the sea still whispered the same rhythm, but there was a shift in the air, as if the world had exhaled and left me in peace. I went about my routine as always. Coffee at sunrise, letters at the table, walks by the harbor when the afternoon turned gold. But now, every moment felt lighter, like I had finally stopped living for explanations. There was nothing left to defend, nothing left to prove. Sometimes the past tried to visit me, knocking softly in my dreams. I would see my husband again, sitting by the porch with that gentle smile, telling me without words that I'd done what was right. I'd wake up with the scent of the ocean drifting through the open window and realize he wasn't gone. Not really. He was everywhere, in the sea breeze, in the quiet, in the way my heart no longer hurt when I remembered him. One morning, I went to the post office to send a small donation to the community center. The clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, recognized my name. She said her niece was one of the children in the new art class. They call it the Lighthouse Project, she said. It's been the highlight of their week. Hearing that made me smile. Maybe that's what my life was meant to become, quiet light after a storm. On my walk back, I passed a bookstore. In the window, there was a sign that said used books, used hearts, all welcome. I stepped inside. The smell of old pages wrapped around me like warmth. I picked out a small novel and paid with cash. The man behind the counter asked if I was new in town. I told him yes, but not new to rebuilding. He laughed softly as if he understood more than he said. That evening, while reading by the window, I noticed the mailbox flag outside was up. Someone had left a letter. I carried it inside, sat at the table, and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was my son's again. This one was longer, more honest. He said he had left his wife. He said he finally saw through her words, the manipulation, the charm, the hunger for what wasn't hers. He apologized for everything, for not listening, for not seeing how much I had done for him. He wrote that he missed me, that he wanted to start over, that he hoped one day I'd let him visit. I didn't cry. I just sat there, feeling the weight of the letter in my hands. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't come in tears. It comes in the stillness after years of noise. I placed the letter beside the first one, a small stack of lessons written in ink. Then I made a decision. The next morning, I baked a small apple pie, the same recipe he used to beg for when he was a boy. The smell filled the apartment with something close to nostalgia. I packed it neatly in a tin box and wrote a note. For when you find your way home, not the house, but the kind of home that loves you back. I mailed it without an address, just his name and the town he had mentioned in his letter. If it reached him, it would be enough. Days turned into weeks again. I noticed new people moving into the empty apartments nearby. Life kept flowing, indifferent and kind at once. The children still came to paint by the beach, their laughter trailing through the wind. Sometimes they waved at me, calling me Grandma by the sea. It made me laugh more than I expected. Then one evening, as the sun dipped low, a knock came at my door. I opened it to find my son standing there, alone, holding a bouquet of daisies. His eyes were tired, his shirt wrinkled, but his smile, his smile was the same as when he was little. He asked if he could come in. I stepped aside without a word. We sat at the table in silence for a while, the sound of the sea breaking softly outside. He looked around the small apartment, the modest furniture, the photo of his father on the wall. He said it was beautiful. I told him it was enough. He nodded and finally spoke about everything. The wedding, the lies, how fast things had fallen apart. He said he thought happiness came from what you own, but now he knew it came from what you keep sacred. When he finished, I poured us both tea. The steam rose between us like the first breath of a truce. He apologized again, but this time I reached across the table and took his hand before he could finish. I told him there was nothing left to forgive. The past had already washed itself clean. We spent hours talking about small things. How the town looked at sunset, the children by the shore, the pie I used to bake on Sundays. He laughed when I told him I still used the same recipe. For a moment it felt like time folded, bringing back the warmth I thought was gone forever. Before he left, he asked if he could visit again next week. I said yes. But as he reached the door, he hesitated. He turned back and asked, almost shyly, if I would ever consider moving back closer to him someday. I smiled and said maybe. Not now. Not yet. Some wounds need distance to finish healing. After he left, I stood at the window and watched his car disappear down the street. The sea breeze slipped through the curtains, carrying that faint smell of salt and promise. I realized I wasn't alone anymore. Not in the way that hurts. I was simply by myself. And that was enough. That night, I lit another candle. The flame swayed gently, reflecting off the framed photo of my husband. I whispered a quiet thank you for the years that built me, for the heartbreak that shaped me, for the peace that followed. Outside, the tide moved steadily, indifferent to human stories, yet somehow mirroring every rise and fall. As I sat there, I thought about the words I had once written on that wedding card. I hope your honeymoon is everything you dreamed of. It had been meant as a blessing, but now, years later, it sounded like a lesson. Dreams change. Love changes. But strength stays. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and listened to the ocean. It was still singing the same song, but now I finally understood the lyrics. It wasn't about loss or revenge anymore. It was about survival. About starting again when no one expects you to. About the quiet kind of power only mothers ever truly understand. Autumn came quietly, wrapping the harbor in pale gold light. The mornings turned crisp and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke. My days had fallen into rhythm again, slow, deliberate, peaceful. I had learned the small rituals that made loneliness bearable. Opening the curtains early, brewing coffee strong, watering the plants while the gulls called across the bay. I no longer checked the phone as much. Silence had become a friend, not a punishment. One afternoon, I walked to the market for apples. The vendor greeted me with a familiar smile. He had begun saving the best ones for me, red, firm, the kind that kept well through the season. I liked that small kindness. It reminded me that the world still had gentle corners, even after so much cruelty. As I handed him the bills, I noticed a familiar figure across the street. My son. He hadn't seen me yet. He was carrying groceries, walking briskly, his coat too thin for the cold. For a moment, I wanted to call out, but I didn't. Some distances must remain, not out of anger, but to protect what was rebuilt. That evening, I baked another pie. I used the same recipe, the same rhythm of stirring sugar into butter until it turned golden. The smell filled the apartment, warm and forgiving. When the timer rang, I took it out and placed it on the counter to cool. The light from the window touched the crust, turning it the color of memory. I thought about sending a slice to him. Then I smiled at my own softness. Maybe later. The next morning, I found a note slipped under my door. It was written in his handwriting, steady, careful, almost hesitant. He said he'd seen me at the market and didn't want to intrude. He just wanted me to know he was doing better, that he'd found work nearby, that he was trying to live differently. At the bottom of the page, he'd written, I still think about the beach house. Not the walls or the view, but the way you used to make it feel like home. I folded the letter slowly, pressing it against my heart before tucking it away with the others. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the window, watching the reflection of the moon ripple across the dark water. My thoughts drifted between the past and what was left of the future. I wondered if he would ever truly understand why I did what I did. Maybe he would, one day. Or maybe mothers are destined to carry their reasons quietly, like a hidden scar no one asks about. The next day, I decided to walk along the beach. The sand was cold beneath my shoes, and the wind tangled my hair. The waves rolled in slowly, carrying the faint echo of laughter from years ago, birthdays, summer dinners, the soft hum of a house filled with love. I picked up a small seashell and turned it in my palm. Its edges were rough, but the inside was smooth as glass. Time does that. It softens the things that once cut us. As I walked back toward town, I passed by the children's art class again. They were sitting in a circle, painting small wooden boats. Their teacher waved at me, inviting me to join. I sat for a while, just watching them dip brushes into colors brighter than the day itself. One little girl offered me her brush and said I could paint the sky. So I did. I painted it wide and endless, like freedom. That evening, as I washed the paint from my hands, there was another knock at my door. This time, it wasn't my son. It was a woman, a neighbor I'd spoken to only once before. She said she'd just moved into the apartment across the hall. She brought me a small bouquet of dried lavender and said, "For peace." I thanked her and placed it in a vase on the table. When she left, I realized how easily kindness can step into the spaces where pain once lived. Days later, I received a small envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. My son was standing by the ocean, smiling. Not the forced kind I'd seen at his wedding, but real, unguarded. He was holding a small wooden boat painted blue and white, the same one the children's class made every weekend. I stared at that picture for a long time. Then I placed it next to my husband's photo, letting their smiles meet across the years. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. I made tea and stepped outside to the balcony. The sky was streaked with pink and orange, and for the first time in decades, I felt entirely free. I thought about the woman I had been, the one who cried quietly in her car, the one who held her breath through betrayal, the one who smiled through heartbreak. She had done her part. She had survived. I whispered a small prayer into the morning air, not for revenge, not even for forgiveness. Just gratitude, for the strength to walk through fire and still choose gentleness on the other side. Later that day, I walked to the post office again. I mailed a postcard addressed to my son's workplace. It said only this: "You found your own peace. I'm proud of you." No signature, no explanation. He would know. As the sun began to set, I sat by my window again. The harbor lights blinked one by one, reflections rippling across the water. I thought of all the endings I'd feared in my life, and how each one had quietly led me here, to this stillness, to this view, to this moment of quiet victory. The world outside kept turning, unaware of my small triumph. But that was enough. I had written my own ending, not the one they expected, not the one they could control, just mine. And as the tide moved closer to shore, I realized something I hadn't understood before. Peace doesn't arrive when the storm ends. It comes when you stop waiting for anyone else to calm the sea. Winter crept in quietly, softening the sound of the harbor. The mornings came slower now, wrapped in fog that blurred the edge of the water. I had begun to love those quiet hours when the world felt half asleep, and I could breathe without memory pressing down on me. The little apartment was warmer than it used to be, filled with plants that grew stubbornly toward the pale light, and the faint smell of cinnamon from the tea I now preferred to coffee. My life had shrunk to simple things: tea, books, long walks, and silence that no longer frightened me. It had been months since I mailed that postcard to my son. I hadn't heard back, but I didn't expect to. I knew he needed space, the same way I once did. Healing isn't a letter, it's a long walk home, and everyone takes a different road. Still, I thought of him sometimes, the boy he used to be, his laughter echoing through the beach house before time changed everything. I would look at his photo on the windowsill and whisper a small prayer that wherever he was, he had found warmth. One morning, I woke to the sound of knocking. It was soft, hesitant. I opened the door to find my neighbor, the woman with the lavender bouquet. She looked flustered, holding a small box. She said someone had dropped it at the wrong apartment. My name was written on it in careful handwriting. I thanked her and closed the door, heart beating a little faster. I set the box on the table and stared at it for a while before opening it. Inside was a small wooden frame with a photo of my son standing beside a group of children. They were holding little boats, smiling under the bright sky. Tucked in the corner was a note in his handwriting. He said he had started volunteering at the art program, helping the kids build those same boats I once saw by the shore. He wrote that the sea reminded him of home and of me. At the bottom, he'd written just 2 words, "Thank you." I sat there for a long time, the photo resting in my hands. I didn't cry. I only felt the kind of quiet that fills you when a wound has finally turned into a scar. It was proof of survival, proof that something broken could still become beautiful. Later that afternoon, I walked to the community center. The same children were there, painting, laughing, the smell of salt and acrylic filling the air. Their teacher recognized me and waved. She said she had a surprise. Then, from behind one of the easels, my son appeared. He looked different, older, calmer, his eyes carrying a kind of humility that only comes from learning the hard way. He smiled when he saw me and said he thought I'd be here. We stood there for a moment, unsure what to say. Then he asked if I wanted to help the kids paint. I nodded. He handed me a brush, and for the first time in years, we stood side by side, not as mother and child divided by resentment, but as 2 people rebuilding something wordless between them. As the sun dipped lower, he told me about his new life. He said he had moved into a small apartment near the center, started working at the harbor fixing boats, saving money, learning patience. He didn't talk much about her. He didn't have to. The silence around her name was enough. I didn't ask because I no longer needed explanations. Some endings don't deserve retelling. When the class ended, we walked together toward the pier. The sky was streaked with violet and pink, and the waves shimmered beneath it like silver threads. He asked if I was happy here. I said I was. He nodded and said maybe one day he'd find a place that felt the same. We didn't say goodbye when we parted. We didn't need to. We just smiled, and he promised to visit again soon. That night, I sat by the window, watching the harbor lights flicker across the dark water. The small wooden frame sat beside my candle, his smile frozen in a moment of peace. I thought about all the years we had lost, and all the ways life gives you back what you thought was gone, just in a different shape. A few days later, I received a call from the community center asking if I would help teach storytelling to the children once a week. They said the kids loved hearing me talk about the sea, about the old house, about how life changes like the tide. I agreed. It felt right to give something back, to turn everything that had hurt into something that could guide someone else. So I began again. Every Thursday, I sat in that sunlit room with those little faces looking up at me, their hands stained with paint and curiosity. I told them stories about strength, about forgiveness, about how sometimes love isn't soft. It's choosing peace, even when it means letting go. They listened quietly, as if they already understood. After class one day, my son walked me home. He carried my bag, just like he used to when he was young. We talked about nothing and everything. When we reached my door, he asked if he could come by for dinner sometime. I said I'd make his favorite, roast chicken with thyme. He smiled and said, just like before. That evening, I looked around my apartment. The lavender on the table, the books stacked neatly, the candle burning low. I realized how much life had changed since that wedding day. The betrayal that once burned like fire had cooled into something I could hold without flinching. I was no longer the woman who had been wronged. I was the woman who had reclaimed herself. As I lay in bed that night, I thought about the past one last time. The sound of her voice at the wedding, the sting of her words, the look on my son's face when he didn't defend me. Those memories no longer hurt. They were simply markers on the map of how I got here. The sea outside whispered like it always did, endless and forgiving. I closed my eyes, breathing in its rhythm. My heart, at last, was quiet. There were no battles left to fight, no revenge left to serve. Only peace, and the long, steady sound of waves reminding me that even after the harshest storms, the tide always comes home. Spring arrived with a slow thaw, the kind that seeps into your bones and reminds you that life, no matter how bruised, always finds its way back. The harbor no longer wore its gray coat. The water shimmered again, restless and alive. I had begun planting flowers on the small balcony. Nothing fancy, just lavender, mint, and a few daisies. They grew stubbornly toward the sun, as if they too believed in second chances. Every morning I would sit there with my tea, watching the petals tremble in the breeze, thinking how strange it was to finally live a life that didn't hurt. My son came by often now. Not every day, but enough to fill the spaces that once echoed with silence. He always brought something: fresh bread from the bakery, a newspaper folded just right, sometimes a handful of shells he found near the docks. We talked about simple things: the weather, the children at the community center, the way the sea changed color with the sky. It wasn't the kind of love that needed to be said aloud anymore. It was steady, like the tide, predictable in its return. One afternoon, he brought a guest, a woman. She looked nothing like his first wife. There was no polished smile, no cold perfume. She wore her hair loose, and her hands were rough, like someone who worked hard and laughed often. She greeted me with the warmth of someone who didn't need to perform. I saw the hesitation in my son's eyes as he introduced her, the silent question of whether I would approve. I didn't say much, just smiled and invited them in. The air between us was fragile, but not tense. It felt new. We sat together over tea, sunlight spilling across the table. The woman spoke softly, asking about my garden, about the children I taught. When she mentioned she volunteered at the same center, I realized this meeting wasn't an accident. My son had met her through the same program, the one I helped fund. Life had circled back on itself in a way that felt like grace. After they left, I stood at the window watching them walk away, their hands brushing as they crossed the street. It wasn't pride that filled me then. It was peace. The kind that comes when you know the world doesn't owe you an apology anymore. I had lived long enough to see everything come full circle. That night, I wrote a short entry in my journal. I hadn't written in months, but the words came easily now. I wrote about how life bends without breaking, how even betrayal can lead you somewhere softer if you let it. I ended it with a note to myself. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It's refusing to carry the ashes forever. Weeks passed. The town grew busier with tourists as summer neared, and my son began helping repair old boats down at the dock. Sometimes after work, he'd stop by just to sit on the balcony with me. We didn't always talk. The silence between us had changed. It was no longer filled with regret, but understanding. One evening, he mentioned his ex-wife. He said she'd left the state after trying to take what wasn't hers one last time. His tone held no anger, only exhaustion. I told him the sea always returns what belongs to it. He laughed, saying I always had a way of turning pain into poetry. The community center invited me to speak at a small gathering in June. They wanted me to share how the foundation had started. When I stood before that little crowd, I looked out and saw my son in the back, smiling. My voice trembled at first, but steadied as I spoke about the house by the sea, about how everything began with love, then loss, then something stronger than both, resilience. I didn't mention names or betrayal. Some stories are better told through lessons than details. When I finished, they clapped, and for the first time in a long while, I felt proud, not of what I'd endured, but of what I'd become. Later that evening, I found a letter slipped under my door again. It was from my son. He thanked me for never giving up on him, even when he didn't deserve it. He said he finally understood what I meant when I told him, love isn't ownership, it's respect. He signed it with just one word, always. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside my old jewelry box, the same one his father had given me decades ago. Inside it were only a few things now, a photo, a ring, and that first note I'd sent after the wedding, the one that said I hoped their honeymoon would be everything they dreamed of. Looking at it now, it felt like a message sent to a different lifetime. That woman, the one who wrote it, had no idea how strong she'd have to become. The next morning, I walked to the shore. The air was cool, the sand soft underfoot. I watched the waves roll in, erasing every footprint, every trace of where I'd stood. It felt like the sea's way of saying, you can start over anytime you want. I picked up a shell, smooth, white, shaped like a heart, and slipped it into my pocket. When I got home, I placed it beside the small wooden frame on my table. The picture of my son with the children, their smiles unguarded and bright. I realized then that I had kept only what truly mattered. Love that had survived disappointment, and peace that had survived pain. That evening, as I sat on the balcony watching the sun melt into the sea, the lavender brushed softly against the railing, filling the air with its scent. My son called to say they were having dinner by the docks and asked if I wanted to join. I told him I'd come. It was such a simple thing to say, but it carried the weight of every step I'd taken to reach this moment. I stood, smoothed the wrinkles from my dress, and smiled at the quiet room. The candle flickered on the table, and the last light of the day painted everything in gold. I whispered to myself that maybe, after all these years, the storm had not taken me. It had carved me. And now, what was left was not the woman who was betrayed, but the one who had learned how to live beyond it. Outside, the tide whispered against the shore, steady as breath, endless as forgiveness. I closed the door behind me and walked toward the sound. Summer came bright and unapologetic, spilling sunlight across every surface of the little apartment. The harbor buzzed again, full of tourists with wide hats and cameras, and I found myself smiling at the noise. There was a time when I would have resented the world for moving on while I was still trying to catch my breath. Now I let it move. I'd finally learned that peace doesn't mean silence. It means learning which sounds belong to you and which ones you can let pass by. My son had kept his promise. Every Sunday, without fail, he came for dinner. Sometimes he brought the woman with him, sometimes he came alone. He helped me carry groceries, fix the latch on the balcony door, and always insisted on washing the dishes. There was an ease between us now, a quiet understanding that love didn't need to be loud to be real. I could see traces of the boy he once was, hidden under the man he had become. When he laughed, it filled the room in a way that made every scar in my heart ache less. One evening, as the sky melted into deep orange, he came early, holding something behind his back. When I asked what it was, he just grinned and said it was a surprise. After dinner, he placed a small envelope in front of me. Inside was a deed, a legal document transferring partial ownership of a boat repair business at the harbor. My name was on it. He said he wanted to thank me for helping him start over, that without me, none of it would have happened. For a moment, I couldn't find words. The same hands that once trembled from grief now trembled from gratitude. I told him that his success was his own doing, but he shook his head. He said he finally understood that everything he had built came from the foundation I'd laid, even when he didn't see it. After he left that night, I sat at the table long after the dishes were cleared. The paper in front of me seemed to glow in the lamplight. My husband's photograph was still on the shelf, smiling at me from another lifetime. I whispered into the still air that maybe, just maybe, I had done something right after all. The next morning, I went down to the harbor to see the workshop. It was small but full of life. Wood shavings, the smell of varnish, the hum of conversation. The men there greeted me warmly, already knowing who I was. They said my son talked about me often, said I was the reason he believed in rebuilding things that break. I stood there for a while, breathing in the scent of sawdust and sea salt, and realized I hadn't felt this proud in years. Life found its rhythm again. My garden thrived, the children at the community center finished their projects, and the woman my son was seeing began to visit more often. She brought me books, helped me bake bread, and laughed with the kind of sincerity that filled the house with warmth. One afternoon, she confessed that she had been nervous meeting me at first because she knew what had happened in his past. She said she never wanted to be another reason for pain. I looked at her and told her pain is a teacher, not a curse. It shows you what kind of love not to repeat. Her eyes softened, and I saw in her the rare kind of kindness that asks for nothing in return. As weeks passed, I noticed something shift inside me. The anger, the resentment, all the things that once lived like ghosts in my chest had gone quiet. I could speak about the past without shaking. Sometimes, I even caught myself being grateful for it. Without the betrayal, I would never have learned the art of letting go. Without the storm, I'd never have found the strength to stand alone. One evening, as I watched the sunset from my balcony, I felt a breeze brush against my face, carrying the scent of the ocean and salt. It reminded me of my husband again, the way he used to whistle while fixing the old porch railing, the way he'd say that everything in life, even heartbreak, needed air to breathe. I closed my eyes and whispered into the wind that I was okay now, that I had finally made peace with all of it. A week later, my son called to tell me he had proposed to his new partner. He said he wanted to do things differently this time. Quietly, simply, without spectacle. He asked if I would come. My heart stilled for a moment. Weddings had once been a wound for me, but this time felt different. I told him I'd be there. The ceremony took place by the harbor, where the smell of salt water mixed with wildflowers. It was small, just close friends, a few children from the art program, and the sea as a witness. My son stood there, not as a man desperate to impress the world, but as someone who had finally learned what mattered. When he saw me, he smiled, and in that moment everything, the betrayal, the pain, the long years of silence, seemed to dissolve into the sunlight. After the ceremony, he hugged me tightly. He didn't say thank you or I'm sorry. He didn't have to. His silence carried all the words we had spent years trying to find. As they drove away for their honeymoon, he handed me a small card. Inside it said the same words I had once written to him years ago. I hope your honeymoon is everything you dreamed of. Only this time, he'd added one more line beneath it. And I hope you finally have yours too. That night, I placed the card beside the first one, the one that had once marked the start of my heartbreak. 2 lifetimes folded together, one ending and one reborn. I stood by the window, the harbor lights blinking like small promises across the water. I realized then that life doesn't always give you happy endings. It gives you quiet ones, the kind that arrive when you least expect them, wrapped in forgiveness and time. As the waves crashed softly against the shore, I whispered a small prayer, not for revenge, not for redemption, but for continuation. For my son, for myself, and for every woman who has ever been broken and rebuilt from the pieces. The tide outside rose higher, carrying the echo of laughter, of endings turned into beginnings. And as the moon rose over the sea, I thought about all the things I had lost, and all the things I had gained because of it. I wasn't just the mother who had been betrayed anymore. I was the woman who had survived it, learned from it, and loved beyond it. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. The days after the wedding felt softer than I expected. The world seemed quieter, not because it had stopped moving, but because I had. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of unfinished grief pressing on my chest. The sun rose and fell without drama, and I let it. My mornings returned to the rhythm I loved. Tea steeping in the blue mug, lavender brushing against the balcony rail, the sea humming its endless lullaby. I was no longer waiting for an apology that might never come, nor forgiveness that had already been given. My son and his new wife visited a week later, both glowing from the simplicity of their ceremony. They brought a small seashell from their honeymoon, white with faint golden lines across its surface. He said it reminded him of me, of strength that didn't have to shout. I laughed, placing it beside the other keepsakes on the windowsill. They stayed for dinner, helping in the kitchen while music played softly from the radio. Watching them move around the room felt like watching a life rebuild itself in quiet, deliberate motions. After they left, I lingered in the silence they left behind. It wasn't lonely. It was full. I looked around my home and realized it had become something sacred. Not a monument to what was lost, but a living space built on what remained. There was a time when I believed that betrayal had stolen everything from me, but now I saw it had only stripped away what was never mine to keep. What was left, resilience, grace, and peace, was stronger than anything I'd had before. Summer faded into early autumn. The air grew crisper, and the sound of the sea deepened, heavier but still comforting. The children's art program continued every Saturday, and I still volunteered. My son often joined, teaching the boys how to sand wood for the little boats. The kids adored him. I would watch him from across the courtyard, his easy smile, the patience in his voice. And I knew the man he'd become was worth every sleepless night I had ever endured. One afternoon, as I was leaving the center, one of the little girls handed me a folded piece of paper. She said it was for me. When I opened it later that night, I saw a crayon drawing, Me and my son standing by the ocean, both smiling, with a small heart drawn above us. Beneath it, in shaky handwriting, she'd written, "You made the sea happy again." I stared at it for a long time, my eyes burning. It was a child's words, but they felt truer than anything else I had heard in years. That evening, I sat on the balcony with a blanket over my knees, watching the horizon fade into indigo. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint laughter of people dining near the pier, the clinking of glasses, the echo of joy. I thought about how far I had come from that night years ago, the night I stood outside my son's wedding, heartbreaking under the weight of someone else's greed. If I could speak to that woman now, I'd tell her not to beg for understanding. I'd tell her that one day she would stand in this same spot and feel peace where pain used to live. As the days shortened, my son began visiting less frequently, busy with his new life. But he always called. Sometimes, we didn't talk about anything important, just the weather, the garden, the way the sea looked that morning. Once he mentioned wanting to buy back the old beach house someday, not as an inheritance, but as a shared space for memories. He said he wanted his children, when he had them, to know where their family began. Hearing that made something inside me shift, a quiet pride, the kind that doesn't need applause. The first rain of the season came one night while I was writing in my journal. The sound was steady, soft, like the world exhaling. I closed the curtains halfway, leaving just enough of a gap to see the glow of the streetlight reflecting off the wet road. The world looked washed clean. I made tea and reread the letters my son had sent over the years, the angry ones, the regretful ones, the tender ones. Each one was a chapter of our story, proof that love can survive even when it's fractured. Weeks later, I received a call from him asking if I could watch their new puppy for a weekend. I laughed and said yes, surprised at how quickly the years had shifted us into something ordinary and beautiful. When he dropped the puppy off, his wife hugged me and thanked me again for welcoming her so openly. I told her that life had already taught me enough about holding grudges, and that love, when given freely, doesn't lose its shape. That weekend, I found myself walking the puppy along the shoreline at sunset. The sky was painted in shades of gold and rose, and the tide reached just close enough to touch my shoes. I thought about my husband, about the beach house, about the life that had unfolded in such unexpected directions. There was no bitterness left, only gratitude for the journey. When I returned home, I sat at the table and took out an old card, the one I had written so many years ago, the one that began it all. I read it again, the words that had once carried irony and pain. But now, they felt different. They felt full circle. I placed it in an envelope and wrote on the back, "We made it." Then I tucked it into the jewelry box beside the letters and closed the lid gently. Later that night, as the sea murmured outside and the candle burned low, I whispered a quiet prayer for the woman I had been, for the son I had raised, and for the life we had rebuilt from the ashes. The world outside kept moving. The tide rose and fell, the gulls cried in the distance, but inside everything was still. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the sound of the waves carry me. There were no more battles to fight, no debts to settle, no ghosts to chase. Only love, quiet and complete. The kind that stays. The kind that heals everything it touches. The autumn wind began to carry the first hints of chill, brushing past the lavender pots on my balcony and rattling the leaves that clung to their stems. I had learned to love that sound, the whisper of change, soft but steady. It reminded me that life always moves, even when it feels still. The mornings were colder now, so I kept a shawl draped around my shoulders as I sat by the window with my tea, watching the harbor shift through shades of silver and blue. My son had called the night before to tell me he'd been offered a partnership in the boat repair business. He sounded proud, but nervous. I told him pride was earned in the quiet work, not the loud announcement, and I could hear him smile through the phone. A few days later, he came by with his wife and that little puppy that already outgrown its clumsy phase. They brought dinner with them, and the house smelled like roasted vegetables and garlic bread. We ate together, laughing at small things, the puppy circling our feet as if claiming us all. When I watched the two of them move together, handing plates, exchanging glances, I realized that they had built something gentle, something real. It was not the kind of love that sparkled in photos. It was the kind that grows roots quietly beneath the surface. After dinner, while they cleared the table, I stepped outside to the balcony. The sea stretched out in front of me, calm and vast, with the moon just starting to rise over it. I thought about how much time had passed since that first wedding, how grief had once felt like a permanent stain. But standing there, wrapped in the cool air, I understood that grief doesn't vanish. It just learns to live beside you. It becomes a shadow that no longer frightens you, a part of the landscape rather than the storm itself. My son joined me a few minutes later. He leaned against the railing, silent for a long while, his eyes tracing the waterline. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. He said he sometimes still thought about everything that happened, the words that were said, the way he'd failed to see what was right in front of him. I told him we all carry moments we wish we could rewrite. What matters is whether we let them harden us or teach us. He nodded, and in that small gesture I saw a man who had learned to forgive himself. That, I realized, was all I'd ever wanted for him. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of life continued its soft, unbroken pace. I spent my days between the community center and home, teaching stories and planting new herbs. The children had started calling me Grandma by the Sea, and though the nickname made me laugh, it filled me with a kind of pride I hadn't expected. They drew me pictures of waves and boats and sunsets, filling my walls with color. Each one felt like a small piece of redemption. One afternoon, the woman who ran the center asked if I'd consider leading a small writing group for the parents. She said my stories had inspired others to start sharing their own. I hesitated at first, unsure what I could possibly teach beyond endurance. But she smiled and told me that's exactly what people needed, to learn how to turn endurance into expression. I agreed. The following week, a small circle of women gathered in the sunlit room, each holding a notebook. Some of their faces were tired, some curious, all of them hopeful. We began by writing about the hardest moment we had ever survived, and as the pens scratched across paper, I could feel something unspoken lifting from the air. It was the sound of healing beginning again, quietly, like waves meeting the shore. That night after class, I walked home slowly through the fading light. The air smelled of rain, and the world felt soft, washed clean. I thought about all the women I'd met, each carrying her own version of loss, betrayal, disappointment. Yet beneath all of it, there was strength. Different faces, same storm, same survival. When I reached home, I placed my notebook on the table and opened to a blank page. For the first time, I began writing my story from the very beginning, not as a wound, but as a record of rising. As the words flowed, I found myself smiling at the memories, the good ones, the painful ones, the ones that shaped me. The night I overheard those cruel words at my son's wedding. The morning I sold the house she thought she owned. The quiet satisfaction of reclaiming what was mine without raising my voice. Those moments no longer felt like scars. They felt like steps on a long, steady climb back to myself. Weeks later, my son came by with his wife again, this time with news. They were expecting a baby. When he told me, I froze for a second, the world going still around me. Then the emotion rose so quickly that I couldn't stop the tears. He wrapped his arms around me, laughing, calling me Grandma like the children at the center did. His wife stood beside him, her eyes soft, full of trust. I felt something inside me settle, an old ache finally replaced by something pure and new. After they left, I sat at the window long into the night. The sea was quiet, reflecting the moon in a perfect silver line. I thought about the life ahead, not just mine, but theirs, and the child they would bring into it. I wondered if someday that child would stand on this same balcony, listening to the same waves, and know the strength of the women who came before. In that stillness, I whispered a thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to time itself, for its patience, for its mercy, for showing me that peace is not found in forgetting, but in remembering without pain. I touched the seashell my son had given me and placed it over my heart, feeling the smooth surface warm against my skin. Outside, the tide was rising, slow and sure, wrapping itself around the rocks. I watched until the horizon blurred into the dark. The candle on the table flickered once, then steadied, its flame holding firm. I smiled, knowing that some lights don't burn out, They simply learn how to glow through the wind. Winter returned once more, though this year it felt gentler. The mornings were still cold, the sea still gray, but the light that poured through my curtains carried warmth instead of loneliness. I had learned how to move through silence without feeling lost in it. Every creak of the floorboard, every whistle of wind through the window felt like an old companion now. My life had become quieter, but full in its own way, like a book that had been read many times, soft at the edges, but still whole. The baby came in early February. My son called me before dawn, his voice trembling with joy. I remember standing there, the phone pressed to my ear, my breath catching when he said the words, "She's here, she's healthy, she's perfect." I didn't cry at first. I just stood still, the world around me slowing down until all I could hear was the faint hum of the ocean outside. Then the tears came, steady and warm. It felt like something inside me, something that had been clenched tight for years, finally let go. A few days later, they brought her home. When I held her for the first time, she was wrapped in a soft pink blanket, her tiny fingers curling around mine as if she'd known me all along. My son watched quietly, his hand resting on his wife's shoulder. The look on his face, the mix of pride and gratitude, was something I'd never seen before. He whispered that they'd named her Grace. I smiled, tracing her cheek with the back of my finger. Grace. The perfect word for the ending I never thought I'd have. Life changed in small, beautiful ways after that. My apartment was no longer just mine. It became a second home for little Grace. Her laughter filled the rooms where I once wept. Her toys cluttered the floors where silence used to linger. I found myself humming while cooking again, telling her stories she didn't yet understand. She'd babble back, as if promising to remember them one day. The sea outside seemed to sing with her, its rhythm matching the soft rise and fall of her breath when she slept in my arms. My son often visited after work, exhausted but happy. He'd sit with a cup of tea while his wife played with Grace on the rug. Sometimes he'd look around the room, at the plants, the photos, the little signs of life, and say he didn't realize how much peace could fit into such a small space. I'd tell him peace wasn't measured by size, but by stillness, the kind that stays even when the world keeps turning. He'd smile, the same quiet smile his father used to wear, and for a moment, I'd see them both in the same light. As months passed, I found myself slowing down. Age does that gently, like a tide pulling back without warning. I began to tire more easily, moving through my days at a softer pace. But I wasn't afraid of time anymore. I had made peace with it, just as I had made peace with everything else. There was nothing left undone, no words left unsaid. My son had forgiven me for the years we lost, and I had forgiven him for the ones that hurt. The circle had closed, not with noise or vengeance, but with quiet understanding. One evening near the end of summer, I sat on the balcony with Grace asleep in my arms. The sun was setting in streaks of gold and crimson, the waves below reflecting its glow. My son and his wife were inside, laughing softly as they prepared dinner. The sound of their voices carried through the open door, blending with the murmur of the sea. I looked down at the baby's face, peaceful and perfect, and thought about everything that had led to this moment. The betrayal, the loneliness, the long years of rebuilding. Every step had brought me here, to this stillness. When the breeze picked up, I reached for the small box on the table beside me. Inside were the pieces of my life, the old letters, the shells, the photo of my husband, the first card I had written after my son's wedding so many years ago. I unfolded it one last time and read the words that had once been heavy with irony. They no longer stung. They were simply part of the story, a beginning that had finally found its ending. I tucked the card back into the box and smiled. Later that night, after they had gone home, I stood by the window watching the moon rise above the water. The reflection shimmered like silver dust across the waves. I thought about my husband, about how he always said the sea carries every story, keeps them safe beneath the tide. Maybe he was right. Maybe the pain, the love, the lessons, they all belong to the ocean now, echoing softly in its endless rhythm. I sat down and wrote a letter, not to anyone living, but to life itself. I thanked it for teaching me resilience, for breaking me just enough to show me what strength really was. I thanked it for giving me back my son, for letting me hold my granddaughter, for allowing my heart to find peace, even after being shattered. I folded the paper carefully and placed it in the box with the others. The next morning, I woke to sunlight spilling through the curtains. I made my tea, stepped out to the balcony, and breathed in the scent of salt and lavender. Everything was quiet, but not empty. The sea glimmered, endless and kind. I realized then that my life had come full circle, not in a grand way, but in the gentle way that truly matters. As I sat there, the world felt small and infinite all at once. My heart was steady, my hands still, my eyes soft with the kind of peace that only comes from understanding. Every wound had turned into wisdom, every loss had led to love. The tide rolled in and out, whispering its eternal promise. Everything returns, everything renews. And so it did. That evening, when my son called to say goodnight, his voice sounded lighter than it had ever been. Grace's laughter bubbled through the receiver, and he said they'd visit in the morning. I told him I'd be waiting. After the call ended, I sat for a long time by the window, listening to the ocean hum like an old lullaby. The candle flickered beside me, its flame steady against the wind. In that final stillness, I understood what it meant to live a complete life. Not perfect, not painless, just whole. I closed my eyes and let the sound of the sea carry me, soft, endless, familiar. And as the night deepened, I knew that every storm I had ever endured had only been leading me home.